So let me know if you don't see my screen. It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to see the chat box. So, oh, there it is. Yeah, so if you have any questions, either feel free to type them into the chat box or just go ahead. It's a small group. Unmute yourselves and speak up, and I'll do my best to answer them. So I am Julie Carey. I am a past district staff officer for Marine Safety in 8th Western Rivers. I'm currently the district captain south for the district. And you might be wondering a little bit about my title slide here. So for my day job, I work for the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center with the Advanced Compliance Team tools out of the Construction Engineering Research Laboratory. Part of that job and why I'm using that template is we have responsibility and agreements with a large swath of the federal government to conduct training webinars, much like this one. And so I'm double dipping a little bit. The Coast Guard is one of the agencies that we help support, and so because this is very easily a presentation that I could do either for the Coast Guard or for NOAA or other entities, I just went ahead and stuck it on the template for work. So that if anyone ever asks for this, I don't have to go back and reformat and redo this work. So I'm just gonna go ahead and fess up to that right now. So to start off, before we start talking about marine sanitation devices, I'm going to assume that you all have a basic knowledge of what we're talking about with these. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of a regulatory history. Um, so, passing legislation for water quality, it all started off in 1899 with the Refuse Act and also the Rivers and Harbors Appropriations Act, where Congress basically came in and said, hey, there's so much dumping of trash into our riverways, it's impeding navigation, right? So they weren't worried so much on the environment or on the health. They're worried about the economic impact of the refuse going to the rivers and how that would impact our ability to move goods throughout the country. They left the pollution up to state and local authorities to regulate for themselves. But unfortunately, with World War II starting and the U.S.'s entry into that war, the emphasis really switched to being able to support the war efforts. And we all know that oftentimes going to war and environmental protection isn't always as compatible as we would like for it to be. And so once the war ended in 1948, Congress passed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. It brought that emphasis back onto protecting our waterways. Throughout the years, there had been over 100 bills that had been introduced, but none of them were successful. But after the war, with all the industry that had started up and the growth of our urban centers, the pollution that was created from that really forced Congress's hand to have to do something. And so they finally came up with a bill, but that bill didn't really prohibit pollution, but it only gave limited authority to the federal government to do something. And the federal government could only do something when pollution, the source of the pollution started in one place and it impacted another state. So basically the federal government is coming in and they're telling the state that, hey, you can do whatever you want to your waters as long as it stays in your state. And so for example, the Kansas River, right? As long as the pollution was gone by the time it went from being in Kansas to Missouri, the government didn't have a leg to stand on. But as soon as it crossed that border, Missouri could come back to Kansas and say, "Hey, you need to clean up your act," or they could even create an agreement for what Missouri would accept. So you see this quote here. If you've ever seen The American President, one of my favorite movies, I took a quote from that and kind of modified it. Well then, congratulations. It's only taken you 50 years to put together water pollution legislation that has no hope of preventing water pollution. So we move ahead some to 1972, right? What we now know as the Clean Water Act. Since the time that the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was passed, they kept modifying it and they kept modifying it until it became, as what usually becomes when Congress continues to mess with something, a big mess. And they finally just kind of took all those amendments and consolidated them into one clean act, the Clean Water Act. This act had a lot more force to it. It set industry wastewater standards, right? We talk about effluent, the water coming out of the end of pipes, that wastewater. It set a national water quality criteria for surface waters. If you are familiar with these standards, you might know them as the total maximum daily loads, where any new discharges or any discharger who's doing significant remodels or significant revamping of their processes, that they have to apply for permits that allow them to discharge. And the states will set limits based on the current water quality to prevent impairment to the point where the water cannot meet its purpose or it becomes hazardous to the health or environment. And it requires that permit from a point source to have a permit. Yeah, it requires a discharge from that point source to have a permit under the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. All right, so all of these within the Clean Water Act, we get our requirements for the marine sanitation devices. So the marine sanitation device isn't just the toilet, but it's any of the equipment that's installed that is designed to receive, retain, treat, or discharge the sewage, as well as the process to treat that sewage. And so you see here in this diagram that we have a tank level indicator, the toilet itself, the discharge pump switch, a holding tank, vent line filters, pumps, and all the ports. All of that together makes up the MSD. The EPA requires that these be on board vessels that have installed toilets when those vessels are operating within U.S. navigable waterways. Now, when we say installed toilets, these are ones that do not have a self-contained holding tank that you can take the whole toilet and tank out of the boat. It is one that is actually fixed to the vessel. So that's where the distinction between installed toilets and some of those others, smaller toilets that we see on recreational craft, where there is no pump out, you just take the whole thing out. We're not really going to worry with the definition of U.S. navigable waters. If you've followed the regulations at all, you know that that's a very confusing situation. And at the end of the day, here in 8th Western, it doesn't make that much of a difference, and you'll see why. But I want to talk first about the regulation of the MSDs. Who does this? It's actually a joint effort between the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Coast Guard. The EPA regulates the performance standards, specifically when it comes to fecal coliform and suspended solids. Through Section 312 of the Clean Water Act, they say this is how much of fecal coliform can escape from these devices. This is how much of the suspended solids can be produced from these devices. The Coast Guard then takes those standards and they tell industry, and they review plans. They don't tell industry. They review plans submitted by industry that will, that takes into consideration the design, construction, certification, installation, operations to say, yes, this should meet the goals of the EPA. right? They certify those, and they set criteria that says this device must do this, right? Whatever those standards are. And if you've ever tried doing a Googling search on this, it's very difficult to find a lot of detailed information on how industry is implementing these designs. You would think that it's like a national security secret or something. But in general, we have three types of marine sanitation devices: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 3, I would call the most protective of the three marine sanitation devices. It stores the sewage until it can be discharged either shoreside or at sea. At sea being defined as beyond 3 miles from shore. It can be installed on vessels of any length, and it doesn't have any performance standard because it's really not designed to do any of the treatment that we typically associate with marine sanitation devices. Type 2, and yes, I realize I'm going in reverse. That's just kind of the way I work. Type 2 is flow through treatment devices that employ biological treatment and disinfection. This is what I consider the next level protection. It can be installed on vessels of any length, and it must produce an effluent with no more than 200 per 100 millimeters of milliliters of fecal coliform bacteria, the count of that, and it can't produce more than 150 milligrams of total suspended solids per liter, right? And the reason why I say that that's more protective than the type 1 is when you look at the requirements for a type 1, all it says is that there's no visible floating solids, and then the allowable fecal coliform goes all the way up to 1,000 counts per 100 milliliters. So that's quite a bit more that's allowed in those devices. Type 1s, where type 2s uses the biological treatment and disinfection, type 1s use a physical process, maceration, and then as well as disinfection for the treatment of sewage. These are limited to only two vessels that are less than or equal to 65 feet in length, right? So because it's less protective, they're going to allow it to be used in fewer circumstances than the other two types. So the type 1, I'm going to go through these and show examples. The type 1, I talked about that maceration, the taking the solids and making them liquid. One example that I found is this electrical-based holding tank. You see the wires in this, and they produce a charge that basically turns any salt water into a disinfectant, right? It kills any of the bacteria that's present in that sewage and then discharges it. These are small systems that it's basically a one flush at the time. So you flush the toilet, and whatever is currently in the tank then gets discharged. And then that new sewage then gets treated by this electrical process. Here's an example of a type 2 marine sanitation device. This particular one, which I understand is very typical, has 3 different chambers to it. It has an aeration chamber where the sewage goes in first. There's a little bubbler like what you might see in fish tanks in this chamber, and it helps keep the solids suspended in solution. It keeps them from settling down, so as well as providing air that's needed for the aerobic decomposition. And so the bacteria is floating around in there. It's eating the solids, and then as more water is added, it gets pushed through tiny holes that's in the bottom of the aeration chamber in through to the clarification chamber. The clarification chamber has a biological filter media in it that serves to remove the sludge and smaller waste that made it through the small holes between the two chambers. Part of what makes it a biological filter is it also contains bacteria that then eats any of the particles that get caught in that chamber. And from there, the liquid, all the solids should be gone by this point. The liquid moves into the chlorination chamber, where whether it's tablets or the operator, uses a liquid chlorination chemical, whatever the manufacturer calls for, is to this chamber. The final treatment occurs, and then it can be discharged. And finally, we have our type 3, right? Very, very basic. The sewage goes in and it stays there until it's either pumped out or discharged at sea, right? It's just that one chamber. And there's nothing going on there unless someone decides to add some deodorizing tablets or whatever people do for their comfort. But I just want to clarify, just because the sewage may be treated, it is not carte blanche permission to discharge it into the waters. There is a general prohibition against discharging into freshwater lakes, reservoirs, or impoundments whose inlets and outlets are made such as to prevent the ingress or egress by vessel traffic. So if there's no boats moving in and out of that body of water, then it's a pretty safe bet that you're not allowed to discharge sewage. In other places, no discharge zones may be established either by the EPA or the states. All discharge is prohibited, treated or not. Some of the requirements for establishing a no discharge zone include one of three methods. Either the state determines that it's an exceptional water, or the water's already at risk and they don't want to further impair it, and then they ask the EPA to make a determination whether there's adequate pump out facilities. And if these two criteria are met, then a no discharge zone can be indicated. The EPA can also take a look at the environment and say, yes, this water needs to be protected, and we don't really care that there's not sufficient pump out facilities, right? And yes. In that case, the water's protected, and if you have a holding tank that needs to be pumped out, well, you better know where you're going to take it to do that, because that's not going to be a consideration in their decision. Or if it's in proximity to a drinking water intake, right? No one wants to know that their drinking water is being contaminated by sewage. I mean, yes, it gets treated at the water production plant, but it gets more expensive the more the water is contaminated.
Hey, Julie, this is Alan.
Yes.
Can we ask the person that's calling in on the iPhone to mute their phone? We're getting some background noise. We have one person on the iPhone. If they would mute their phone, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alan. So on the EPA website, they actually have an interactive mapping tool to see where no discharge zones have been designated. But I will warn you to not rely on this map. One example that I know of as I was exploring it is actually Kansas, right? You would, just based off of what we've already talked about, you'd be like, well, why wouldn't Kansas have, why wouldn't the entire state of Kansas be a no discharge zone? I don't have a good answer for that, other than I know that under Kansas Department of Wildlife, Park, and Tourism regulations, so the Kansas administrative regulations are divided up by agency. So this is actually under Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism instead of Health and Environment. You'll see that there is a requirement for MSDs that are capable of discharging sewage to have a valve that's locked in the closed position, such that sewage can't accidentally be released. There's a couple of other options in the regs, but I just pulled out this first one for the purpose of this illustration. And so make sure you know.
So what would be the best practice policy?
The best practice policy for finding out.
At least in general, in regards to what we've been discussing in terms of the discharge of sewage. How should we handle that in terms of research ahead of time? Should we just, in general, not allow ourselves to discharge sewage? Where would we look this information up? How should we conduct ourselves or handle that?
So
Just out of curiosity.
yeah, so when in doubt, assume no discharge is allowed. Otherwise, I would go to your state agency, whether your state would put it under your environmental agency, whether that's a state EPA, Department of Natural Resources, whatever it's called in your state, to find out what their guidance is.
Okay. I figured it was such, you were just kind of giving me, I mean, a little bit of a conflicting message because you were like, yeah, no, it seemed like that we weren't, that no discharge seemed to be everywhere. And then on your map, it only shows like 4 states. And then the majority of the country there seemed like it didn't have any information on it. So,
Right. Yeah, and I wanted to point out that, when you go to look stuff up online, especially if it's on the EPA's website, for whatever reason, you may not get the full story. And so the state is the best place to look this up. And like the example here, it's actually under the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism and not under the state environmental regulations. So,
okay, thanks.
yep, you're welcome.
That's actually, that's a really great answer.
So, well, I'm glad it helped. So, the next thing I want you to be aware of is MARPOL NX4. So if you're familiar with MARPOL, it's a series of international environmental agreements that address different marine pollution. That's what MARPOL stands for, marine pollution. So it addresses those different issues. NX4 is the one that specifically addresses sewage. And just the very brief down low of what's contained in this NX is that all discharge is prohibited within 3 nautical miles of land. Or if it's untreated, it extends that out to 12 nautical miles. It requires that any stored sewage that's being discharged isn't let go all at once, but that the ship discharges it at a moderate rate only when the ship is underway at not less than 4 knots. So they don't want just a cruise ship sitting out there in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico or wherever it's at, dumping everything at once. They want to make sure that it gets dispersed. Each of these ships have to have an approved sewage plan, and it has to have test results as to how efficient its marine sanitation device is in the International Sewage Pollution Prevention Certificate. They also have to make sure that the effluent does not produce floating solids, and that it also doesn't cause a discoloration of the surrounding water. And then finally, the last thing that I just want everyone to be aware of, because I'm not sure when the last time the Pollution Outreach Specialist PQS was updated, but we now have what we call the Vessel General Permit. This requirement was first issued in 2008 as a result of a 5-year legal battle where the Northwest Environmental Advocates sued the federal EPA for excluding incidental discharge from vessels from the regulations, from the Clean Water Act regulations. Then in 2008, so part of that, in 2008, the Clean Boating Act was passed that provided an exemption for recreational vessels, where recreational vessels were defined as a vessel that is manufactured or used primarily for pleasure or leased, rented, or chartered to a person for the pleasure of that person, but does not include a vessel that is subject to Coast Guard inspection and that is engaged in commercial use or carries paying passengers. And so if you're familiar with commercial vessels, you might be running through your head and think about, well, our UPVs, our uninspected passenger vessels, they are typically recreation in type, but even though they are commercial, because the Coast Guard does not require them to be inspected, they're not required to have a vessel general permit. All right, so 2013, the second vessel general permit was issued. These permits typically, whether it's the VGP or another permit issued under MPDS, they're typically good for 5 years. And so that's where you see the 2008 to 2013, and then 2018 we have the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, where Congress tells EPA and Coast Guard, hey, this process isn't working. We need you to redo it. And so EPA and Coast Guard are in the process of completely revamping their VGPs. And in 2020, the EPA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking called the Vessel Incidental Discharge National Standards of Performance. These are technology-based effluent limits and best management practices that vary depending on the class type and the size of the vessel that has this permit. However, these requirements do not go into effect until the Coast Guard publishes implementing regulations, which is anticipated to come out sometime next year. In the meantime, this 2013 permit, while it normally would have been allowed to expire in 2018, the requirements of that permit have been extended, such that large vessels, where large is defined as equal to or greater than 79 feet in length, commercial vessels, except for fishing, meet all 2013 requirements. And then the small vessels, less than 79 feet, and any fishing vessel, regardless of length, only have to worry about the ballast water requirements and then any requirements imposed on them by the state and local governments. And so that is wastewater, marine sanitation devices, wastewater coming from ships in a nutshell. Are there any questions?
Do you have any data on violations, compliance issues that the Coast Guard has seen, especially in our AOR?
I do not. I would imagine that most of the enforcement in our AOR is going to be handled at the state level. The state has authority to implement enforcement actions for marine sanitation devices and other NPDES violations. The exceptions might be along the Mississippi River, the Arkansas River, and perhaps the Missouri River. But I can see what I can find out.
Thanks. And the other question I had, we usually have no problems when we're doing checks at marinas. Right now, where we're seeing a lot of problems with MSD non-compliance when we do vessel safety checks are with a lot of these independent boat operators that don't operate out of a marina. Is that similar? Has anyone seen other issues like that doing safety checks?
Are you talking about where like the Y valve has been left
Yeah.
open?
Yeah, that's typical, though. Probably the number one thing we've seen, I think, is that Y valve being left open.
Yeah, I'll let anyone else speak up who may have experience. I'm not a vessel examiner, so that's not something I've gotten into.
Yeah, Julie?
Yes.
Dan Smith. Yeah, my boat's up on Lake Superior, and one of my major problems when I do the VEs is that Y valve. I saw one of the screens you had up there was highlighted. It says locked in the closed position. And a lot of them, I found out, either zip tie, safety, right there, safety wired or whatever, duct tape, meaning that they know that it's in the off position and it didn't accidentally get turned over. That's the biggest thing I find on the VEs.
Thank you, Dan.
End of comment.
I'm not a vessel examiner, and I don't really know anything about that. But my question is I noticed you mentioned a lot of different sources and said the best place to look these up would be the local government, i.e. the state governments, and their different agencies. But is there, at least in general, a single spot where we can look for these regulations and different compliance standards, at least to have a decent universal source?
So the best spot that I know of would actually be a product that my group produces called the. Well, no, even that wouldn't be a single spot because each state has their own guide. We produce a compliance guide. It's called the Team Guide, and it lists all the regulations. But we have one for federal and then one for each of the states.
Okay, that's cool. I know
Yeah.
in Arkansas we have multiple agencies that handle this kind of things in terms of our state government. We've got a waterway management, and then we've got a whole nother council that, that handle this, and they produce their own individual information, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And so I know on our end, we have multiple different sources, and if all the states are that way, I'm sure that could be kind of confusing
Yeah.
and so one agency might have one policy and another agency might come up with another policy. And so I was just wondering as to where, if we had a single source that we could go to review that information, or if it was just, like you said, looking up at each different one.
Yeah.
So
So
thanks for that clarification.
yep, you're welcome. So the best that I have for you guys, and the Coast Guard does subscribe to this, is would be our team guides have all of those regulations regardless of what agency it comes from. And so in Arkansas, it would have your Arkansas DEQ, your any of we don't necessarily go down to the county level, but any of the other regulatory state agencies, all of those would be located in one place per state. So,
Hey, Julie,
yes.
one thing I noticed on one of the last slides before you took questions is fishing vessels seem to be exempt from the large vessel regulations. They're up to any size. Do you know why that might be?
I remember seeing it in the document. I think basically what it came down to was lobbying power would be my best guess. And they're
Okay, thank you.
yeah, they're not exempt from the marine sanitation device regulations. They're exempt from the incidental discharge requirements.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And as always, I always ask this one question, and that is, as auxiliarist, how can we get involved?
The best thing that we can do, there's actually a couple different ways. One, make sure that when you are conducting your vessel safety checks, you're aware of, you're aware to educate the people of the proper positioning of that Y valve. You encourage them to use the vessel pump out stations. You know where they're at in the area where you're operating. If you're a commercial vessel examiner, that you make sure and talk to the operators about these requirements, and that especially if you get into vessel journal permits, that they have a copy of the permit and they're in compliance with that particular permit. Of course, at that point, the active duty should be with you. So they'll be impressed that you know about the VGP.
That's awesome. Thanks for answering my question.
You're welcome. All right. Who was it that was asking about the compliance and enforcement data? I forgot to.
Yeah, that was me.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I got your name so I could follow up with you if I found anything.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to ask also, what kind of MSDs does the Army Corps of Engineers use on their vessels?
I honestly don't know. I've never been on one of our dredges. I would like to, but I can find out from one of my contacts in the Portland district, and he'll be able to tell me.
Cool.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Hearing none, I hope everyone has a great night.
Actually, oddly enough, I think I do have one question.
Sure.
It's not exactly in regards to this particular lesson that we had today, but in last month's class, we didn't have one. It was postponed. Will we be having that next month or the month after that? Will we get any more information on that, or will we just not have that course
This
this
is
time
Alan
around?
Kitterman, and the answer is yes, we will be making that up. Jonathan Verhoeven was one that was giving it, and he has some schedule conflicts going on, but he is looking for a time to get that done.
Okay, thanks.
Good presentation, Julie.
All right. Thank you, Dan.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
So I hope everyone has a great night.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Julie.
you, Jim.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Have a good night.
Thank you, you
We'll talk
too.
to
Have a
you
good night.
later this month.
Yep. Talk to you later.
Bye, Julie.
Hey, Julie.
Yes.
This is Hugh. I was the iPhone beating my kids. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Did you get me on this? Did you add me on the call so that you know who I was?
Sure. And I missed your name. I'm sorry.
Hugh
Hugh. Okay.
MacFaden.
Yep. I will.
Yeah.
I will add you.
All right. Thank you so
All
much.
right. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I'm done.
Julie, I had some tech issues getting on. Did you get me in?
Yes, you are on.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yep. You're welcome.
You'll probably not even remember it 20 years from now.